Hi everyone, welcome to the lecture on the respiratory system. Our objectives for this lecture are to demonstrate an understanding of the health implications of human anatomy, physiology, nutrition, and we won't cover reproduction in this one. We're going to be able to list the parts of the respiratory system, explain the basic function of the respiratory system, explain the basic principles of a healthy and proper diet, and describe the role of diet and exercise on achieving physical fitness. So gas exchange occurs in respiratory systems. Gases can be exchanged in a few different ways. It can be exchanged across the body surface, like in worms. Their gas exchange crosses through their skin, right? It can also happen by tubules that are connected to the atmosphere, like in insects. And it can also happen across gills or lungs. We'll focus mostly on what happens in mammals with these anatomy lectures, but it's important that you understand that things are different in other types of organisms. All right, respiratory surfaces are where external respiration occurs. And all respiratory surfaces have three similarities. They have a large surface area, contact with air or water, and they're moist. Human respiratory systems delivers air to your lungs, and it's a continuous network of tubules that deliver oxygen gas to the circulatory system and unloads carbon dioxide from the circulatory system into the lungs. This is why we call it gas exchange. Oxygen enters the bloodstream through the respiratory system, and CO2 leaves the bloodstream through the respiratory system. Several types of tissue make up the respiratory system. Epithelial, which is like surface cells, so your skin or the lining of your like blood vessels or the interior of your lungs. All those surface cells, those are epithelial cells. Muscle and connective tissues make up the components of the respiratory system, while nervous tissues regulate their activity. Breathing starts in the upper respiratory system. So this is where air enters your body through the nose and mouth and then passes through your pharynx. The pharynx and the mouth are part of both the digestive and respiratory systems, since both food and air pass through them. The upper respiratory system produces mucus. Dust and other inhaled particles are trapped in the mucus and they're swept out by waving cilia. Cilia are like tiny hairs that line your nasal cavity. All right, coughing brings the mucus, cilia are down in the lungs. My bad. Coughing brings that mucus up to either be spit out or swallowed. In patients with cystic fibrosis, which is a genetic condition, they make very thick, sticky mucus, and it causes a lot of respiratory problems for them. All right, lungs are the main human respiratory organs. The trachea branches into two bronchi, one leading to each branch of the lung. So you can see a bronchi here and a bronchi there. The bronchi branch repeatedly into bronchioles. And the autonomic nervous system controls the contraction of muscles in the bronchioles to adjust airflow. The autonomic nervous system is nervous system activity that happens without you consciously thinking about it. You don't have to remind yourself to breathe, you just do it, right? All right, gas exchange occurs at the alveoli. In each alveolus, plural, singular, each alveolus is a tiny sac with a wall of epithelial tissue, that edge tissue or surface tissue, that's only a single cell layer thick. Oxygen and carbon dioxide gas can diffuse through the thin walls of the alveoli into the neighboring capillaries. This is where the gas exchange is happening. You have oxygen coming from basically the outside environment, entering the bloodstream, and carbon dioxide gas leaving the bloodstream and entering the alveolus. All right, so what's the relationship between the circulatory and the respiratory systems? Pause here and jot down an answer in your own words. Breathing requires pressure changes. So air flows from areas of high pressure to low pressure. So when we inhale and exhale, the air pressure in the lungs changes. So when you inhale, there's low pressure in the lungs, right? And then when you blow air out and exhale, that produces high pressure in the lungs. So you have muscles down here, your diaphragm, that help to control that pressure, basically. So contraction of your diaphragm in the rib cage expands the chest cavity, drawing air in. That creates the low pressure. And then when you go to blow air out, those muscles relax and the rib cage recoils, so it shrinks back up, and that forces the air out of your lungs. So air is always moving from high to low pressure, high to low pressure. We talked about that. All right. Ventilators have been in the news a lot with COVID, right? We've all heard about ventilators. They blow air into the lungs. So injury or illness may prevent contraction of the diaphragm and the rib muscles, and breathing stops because patients can't expand or shrink their lungs on their own. But the use of a ventilator does this service for a patient until they're able to regain that ability on their own. All right, how does air flow through the human respiratory system? Well, it begins with contraction of the diaphragm that expands the chest cavity. That's what pulls air into the body. And air enters your body through your nose or mouth. So nose and mouth here. Then they flow into the trachea, to the bronchus, to the bronchi, bronchioles, and finally down to the alveoli. Gas exchange occurs at the alveoli. When the diaphragm and rib muscles relax, that causes the chest cavity to shrink and air flows out of the body back through the same path it took in. So what's the relationship between the volume of the chest cavity and the air pressure in the lungs? I want you to think about this, jot down your thoughts yourself. You could even draw arrows on the model here if it helps you understand the direction of airflow. All right? Make sure you're writing your answers in your own words. O2 and CO2 diffuse in opposite directions. So gas exchange in the alveoli and at the body's other tissues relies on simple diffusion, movement from high concentration or high pressure to low concentration or low pressure. O2 diffuses into the blood at alveoli and diffuses out of the blood at the tissue cells. So wherever in the body that your cells need that oxygen, that's where it leaves the bloodstream and enters the cells. CO2 enters the blood at those tissue cells and diffuses into the environment at the alveoli. Blood carries oxygen gas and carbon dioxide gas in different ways. Hemoglobin in the red blood cells is the protein that binds oxygen gas. Hemoglobin can carry some CO2, but it doesn't bind to this gas as readily as it binds to oxygen. Instead, enzymes in the red blood cells convert most CO2, carbon dioxide gas, to bicarbonate ions, HCO3-. This is the same ion that's present in carbonated pop. All right, so that HCO3 diffuses into the blood plasma. Good. So oxygen is carried on hemoglobin, but CO2 gets converted to this bicarbonate and it gets carried in the blood plasma. A set of two reversible chemical reactions produce that bicarbonate. So when carbon dioxide gas and water mix, so when water becomes carbonated, it produces carbonic acid. But carbonic acid is also soluble in water, right? So it's going to break down into H plus ions and HCO3- ions, or this bicarbonate. All right, so the H plus ions in the blood changes the pH. This makes it acidic. And that allows the brain to regulate the depth and the rate of breathing. So if you're breathing harder, right? Like if you're exercising, you're going to have more carbon dioxide gas that's building up in your bloodstream, right? And that lets your brain know that you need to breathe more to relieve the body of this CO2 burden, right? So as activity goes up and more CO2 is produced, we would have more of these two reactions occurring, causing an increase in the number of H plus ions, which makes the blood more acidic. And that would cue the brain that we need to breathe at a faster rate to reduce this load. All right, breathing is controlled by a negative feedback of blood pH. So when CO2 levels rise, the blood becomes more acidic. Receptors in the arteries and in the medulla of the brain detect that change in blood pH. And in response, the brain stimulates an increase in the breathing rate. The body acquires additional oxygen gas and releases the excess CO2, maintaining homeostasis and blood gas concentrations. All right, so let's check our comprehension here. Breathing rate is mostly determined by the oxygen concentration in the air, the concentration of CO2 in the blood, the concentration of oxygen in the blood, or the amount of hemoglobin. Well, we just said it's based on that feedback loop and the amount of CO2 in the blood. All right, describe the oxygen and CO2 diffusion gradients. So where is the concentration of oxygen high and where is the concentration low? So you know which way it's moving. And the same for CO2. Where are CO2 concentrations high and where are they low? And which direction is the CO2 moving? In the lungs and in the rest of the body. Jot your thoughts down in your own words. All right, so at this point, you should understand the health implications of human anatomy and physiology with respect to the respiratory system. You should be able to list the parts of the respiratory system and explain their basic function. You should also be able to understand the connection between, we didn't talk about diet in this one, but we did talk about exercise in that feedback loop. If you have any questions, jot them down, bring them to office hours. We can Zoom or chat about them by email, or you can bring them with you to lab.